Right now, as you watch this video, a parallel economy is running beneath the one you can see. It has no headquarters. It files no tax returns. It employs no official workers and generates no official GDP. It does not appear in any government's national accounts, any central bank's financial stability report, or any IMF assessment of global economic health. It cannot be measured with precision because its defining characteristic is invisibility, and yet it is enormous. Economists who study informal and illegal economic activity estimate that the shadow economy globally, the sum of all economic transactions that take place outside official oversight, represents somewhere between $10 trillion and $13 trillion per year, roughly 10% of global GDP. A shadow economy so large that if it were a country, it would be the second or third largest economy on Earth, depending on which estimates you use and which year you measure. Within that broader shadow economy, the specifically criminal layer, the markets for illegal goods and services that operate in violation of specific laws, is estimated at somewhere between $2 trillion and $3 trillion per year. The drug trade alone generates between $400 billion and $500 billion annually. Counterfeit goods, $450 billion. Human trafficking, $150 billion. Illegal wildlife trade, $23 billion. Cybercrime, $1.5 trillion and rising. Illegal arms, $1.7 billion to $3.5 billion in direct trade, though the weapons' economic effects are immeasurably larger. And beneath all of it, a financial infrastructure of money laundering that moves somewhere between $800 billion and $2 trillion per year through the legitimate banking system, cleansing criminal proceeds and returning them to the official economy. These are not numbers on the fringe of economic reality. They are numbers that affect the price of the house you live in, the stability of the bank where you keep your savings, the cost of the drugs your doctor prescribes, the effectiveness of the government services your taxes are supposed to fund, and the safety of the neighborhood where your children go to school. The shadow economy is not separate from the real economy. It is woven through it, interacting with it, dependent on it, and being dependent upon by it in ways that are profoundly uncomfortable to acknowledge. Today, we are going to go inside the shadow. We're going to trace the full architecture of the economy that runs beneath the one you can see. We're going to understand how black markets form, why they persist, how they are structured, who profits from them, how money is laundered through legitimate institutions, and what happens to the official economy when the shadow economy grows too large. We are going to look at the drug trade not as a moral problem, but as an economic one. We are going to examine the informal economy of developing countries, not as a failure, but as a rational adaptation. We are going to trace the money through the banks that clean it, the shell companies that hide it, the real estate markets that absorb it, and the political systems that are corrupted by it. And at the end, we are going to ask the question that economics forces us to ask about any market. If this activity persists despite every effort to suppress it, despite enormous resources devoted to enforcement, despite decades of war on drugs and war on trafficking and war on corruption, what does that tell us about the nature of markets themselves? What does the shadow economy reveal about the official economy that produces it? Buckle up. This is the most invisible and yet most consequential economic story in the world. Before we go inside it, we need to be precise about what we mean. Because the shadow economy is not a single thing. It is a spectrum, and where you draw the lines on that spectrum has enormous implications for how you understand what you're looking at. At one end of the spectrum is what economists call the informal economy. This is economic activity that is legal in substance, but happens outside official registration, taxation, or regulation. The street vendor in Lagos selling phone cases. The plumber in Detroit who takes cash and doesn't report it. The domestic worker in Buenos Aires paid in cash with no Social Security contributions. The small farmer in India who sells at the local market without any official records. The babysitter in London who earns cash in hand. None of these activities are criminal. The goods and services being exchanged are legal. The people involved are not criminals in any meaningful sense. They are operating in an informal economy because official registration and taxation impose costs in time, money, and bureaucratic complexity that are too high relative to the economic benefits they would receive. In developing countries especially, Where the formal economy's institutions are weak, the informal economy is often the majority of all economic activity. The World Bank estimates that the informal economy represents approximately 36% of economic output in sub-Saharan Africa, 38% in South Asia, and 28% in Latin America. Even in developed countries, informal economic activity is substantial. It represents roughly 15 to 17% of GDP in southern European countries like Greece and Italy, 12 to 14% in France and Germany, and approximately 7 to 8% in the United States and the United Kingdom. At the other end of the spectrum is the criminal economy, markets for goods and services that are illegal in themselves, drug markets, counterfeit goods, human trafficking, illegal weapons, cybercrime, extortion, contract killing. These activities are criminal not just because they are unregistered, but because the goods or services themselves are prohibited. In between are a range of activities that involve illegal methods to conduct legal or quasi-legal business. Tax evasion at scale. Not the cash-in-hand plumber, but the multinational corporation, using transfer pricing to shift profits to tax havens. Corruption. The bribe that secures a government contract. Embezzlement. The official who diverts public funds. Smuggling of legal goods to avoid tariffs or import restrictions. For our purposes today, we are going to travel across the full spectrum. But we are going to spend particular time on the specifically criminal black market, the drug trade, the counterfeit economy, the trafficking networks, the cybercrime industry, because these are the markets where the economic logic is most stark, most counterintuitive, and most revealing about how markets work at their most fundamental level. The fundamental insight we need to carry through the entire analysis is this: black markets obey the same economic laws as legal markets. Supply and demand, price signals, competition and monopoly, entry barriers, economies of scale, innovation, brand recognition, quality control, customer loyalty, vertical integration. All of the tools of economic analysis that we use to understand legitimate market supply, with modifications to illegal ones. This is not a comfortable observation. It implies that the behavior of criminal markets is, in many respects, predictable. That prohibition raises prices. That raising prices creates profit opportunities. That profit opportunities attract entrepreneurs. That entrepreneurs compete and innovate. That the strongest survive. That enforcement changes the structure of markets in ways that are not always what policymakers intend. Understanding this logic does not require approving of illegal activity. It requires being honest about how markets actually work. The global drug trade is the largest illegal market on earth by almost any measure. Cocaine, heroin, cannabis, methamphetamine, synthetic opioids, and hundreds of newer psychoactive substances generate an estimated $400 to $500 billion in retail sales annually. For context, that is roughly comparable to the global pharmaceutical industry's prescription drug revenues, the entire GDP of Norway, or the annual revenues of Amazon. To understand how this market works, you need to understand the economics of prohibition. When a government prohibits a substance that a significant number of people want to consume, it does not eliminate the demand. It changes the structure of the market that supplies it. In a legal market, competition drives prices toward cost. Producers who can make something cheaply gain market share. Retailers who operate efficiently survive. Price signals coordinate supply and demand. The market is transparent. Prices are visible, quality is accessible, disputes can be resolved through the courts. Prohibition changes all of this. The cost structure of an illegal market includes not just the cost of production and distribution, but the risk premium, the compensation that producers, distributors, and retailers demand for the probability that they will be arrested, imprisoned, or killed. This risk premium is built into the price. The higher the probability of law enforcement, the higher the risk premium, the higher the price. A kilogram of cocaine that costs approximately $1,500 to produce in Colombia reaches a wholesale market in the United States at approximately $15,000 to $20,000 per kilogram, a markup of roughly 1,000%. By the time it is cut and sold in small quantities at the retail level, the same kilogram has a street value of $80,000 to $120,000. The difference between the production cost and the retail price is not profit. Most of it is compensation for risk, payment to the long chain of intermediaries who take the product through borders and distribution networks, and the cost of violence, the enforcement mechanism that illegal markets use instead of courts. This price structure creates the fundamental paradox of drug enforcement. The more effective enforcement is, the higher the price goes. Higher prices mean higher profits for those who remain in the market. Higher profits attract new entrants willing to take the risks. The market expands to meet the demand even as enforcement intensifies. The war on drugs has been running in the United States since Richard Nixon declared it in 1971. In that period, the global drug trade has grown from a regional business into a $500 billion global industry. The supply side of the drug economy is organized in a structure that has evolved in response to enforcement pressure. The most sophisticated trafficking organizations, the Sinaloa cartel, the Cali cartel in its heyday, the various Mexican cartels that have followed, are not simply criminal gangs. They are vertically integrated multinational corporations that control everything from agricultural production to processing, transportation, border crossing, wholesale distribution, and retail delivery, with the enforcement arm of security and violence as a necessary cost of doing business. The Sinaloa cartel, at its peak under Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, was estimated to generate revenues of $3 billion to $10 billion per year. It employed tens of thousands of people in agriculture, transportation, security, intelligence, money laundering, and retail distribution. It had sophisticated logistics systems, proprietary transportation routes, corrupted government officials at every level, and a communications infrastructure sophisticated enough to evade surveillance for decades. El Chapo's success was not primarily a story of violence. Violence was a tool used to establish territory, eliminate competitors, discipline employees, and intimidate officials. But the primary competitive advantage of the Sinaloa cartel was logistical, the ability to move product reliably in large quantities across borders to distribution points throughout the United States and beyond. This is a supply chain management problem. It requires the same skills that a legitimate logistics company would need to succeed, and El Chapo excelled at it. The retail end of the drug market looks different. Here, instead of a few large organizations controlling supply chains, you have a fragmented retail market with many sellers competing for customers in specific geographic areas. The gang territorial disputes that produce urban violence are, in economic terms, competition for retail market share. The corner drug dealer is the equivalent of a franchise operator, taking supply from a wholesaler and selling to end consumers, but with violence rather than trademark law as the mechanism for protecting territorial rights. The economics of the retail drug trade are not, for most participants, particularly attractive. Studies of drug dealer earnings, including the famous analysis of Chicago's Black Gangster Disciple Nation by economist Stephen Levitt and sociologist Sudhir Venkatesh, found that the average foot soldier in a drug gang earned below the minimum wage. The senior leaders of the organization captured most of the profit. The foot soldiers bore most of the risk of arrest, injury, and death for relatively modest compensation. This is not unique to drug markets. It is the standard structure of any market with many low-skill entrants at the bottom and a few high-skill, well-connected operators at the top who control access to the supply. The drug trade's retail structure looks, in many respects, like the labor market for any low-skill, high-competition job: modest wages, high turnover, poor working conditions. What sustains a retail workforce is not primarily the current wage, but the option value, the possibility, however unlikely, of advancement to a position where the real money is. Combined with the limited legitimate economic opportunities available to those who enter the drug trade, the option value is enough to maintain the labor supply even at below minimum wage levels. The drug trade generates cash, enormous quantities of physical cash, and cash is the drug trade's fundamental problem. You cannot deposit $10 million in cash into a bank without triggering scrutiny. You cannot buy a house in New York or London with a briefcase full of $100 bills without generating questions that even the most corrupt official cannot ignore. The solution is money laundering, the process of taking cash generated by criminal activity and converting it into assets that appear to have a legitimate origin. Money laundering is where the shadow economy and the official economy intersect most clearly, and it is through this intersection that the shadow economy corrupts legitimate institutions. The classic description of money laundering divides it into three stages: placement, layering, and integration. Placement is the initial entry of criminal proceeds into the financial system. This is the most dangerous stage because it involves physically handling large quantities of cash. Common placement methods include structuring, breaking large cash deposits into smaller ones below reporting thresholds, a practice known as smuffing. Currency exchange businesses, which legitimately handle large quantities of cash, are used as conduits. Cash-intensive businesses, restaurants, laundromats, nail salons, car washes, are purchased or created specifically to commingle criminal cash with legitimate revenues. Layering is the process of creating distance between the criminal proceeds and their source through a series of transactions designed to obscure the trail. A cash payment to a shell company in one jurisdiction is transferred to another shell company in a different jurisdiction, which purchases a financial instrument in a third jurisdiction, which transfers funds to a bank account in a fourth jurisdiction. The layers accumulate until the connection to the original criminal activity is so obscured that even sophisticated investigators cannot trace it. The financial infrastructure for layering is concentrated in jurisdictions that combine low or zero corporate tax rates, minimal beneficial ownership, disclosure requirements, and professional services sectors, lawyers, accountants, corporate formation agents, that cater to clients who do not want their financial affairs examined too closely. The British Virgin Islands, the Cayman Islands, Luxembourg, Delaware, Nevada, the Netherlands, Switzerland. These are not just tax havens. They are the plumbing of the global money laundering system, providing the shell companies, the anonymous trusts, and the professional secrecy that make layering possible. Integration is the final stage, in which the layered funds are reintroduced into the legitimate economy in a form that appears entirely legal. Real estate is the most common integration mechanism. A shell company purchases a luxury apartment in London, Miami, or New York with funds that have been layered through multiple jurisdictions. The apartment is either sold, generating a cash profit that appears entirely legitimate, or held as an asset that provides a veneer of wealth without explaining its origins. The scale of money laundering that flows through legitimate real estate markets is staggering. The United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime estimates that between 2% and 5% of global GDP, between $800 billion and $2 trillion, is laundered annually. Much of this flows through real estate. A 2017 study found that in Manhattan, more than 30% of all cash real estate purchases were made by entities with at least one disclosed beneficial owner who matched a government list of officials or other politically exposed persons from high-corruption countries. The luxury real estate market in London, Miami, Los Angeles, Dubai, and Vancouver has been significantly inflated by the inflow of criminal and corrupt money, seeking a stable store of value in jurisdictions with strong property rights. The banks have not been passive participants in this process. They have been active ones. HSBC paid $1.9 billion in fines in 2012 for laundering money for Mexican drug cartels and other criminal organizations. Standard Chartered paid $1.1 billion in fines for transactions that violated sanctions. Deutsche Bank paid $630 million in fines for a mirror trading scheme that moved $10 billion out of Russia through its Moscow, London, and New York offices. Wachovia, before its acquisition by Wells Fargo, laundered at least $378 billion for Mexican drug cartels, the largest drug money laundering case in U.S. banking history. These fines represent a fraction of the profits the banks made from handling the transactions. No senior banker has gone to prison in any of these cases. The settlements are treated as a cost of doing business. The regulatory response is to find the institution, require it to improve its anti-money laundering compliance, and move on. This is not, by any objective measure, an effective deterrent. We have spent the last two sections in the criminal shadow economy. Now let us move to the other end of the spectrum, the informal economy that, in much of the developing world, is not the exception but the norm. In many African, Asian, and Latin American cities, the majority of the working population is employed informally. Street vendors, domestic workers, motorcycle taxi drivers, small-scale traders, construction workers paid daily in cash, seamstresses working from home, all generating income, all producing genuine economic value, all entirely outside the official economy's data and reach. The informal economy in developing countries is not a pathology. It is a rational adaptation to conditions in which the formal economy's institutions are too weak, too costly, or too corrupt to be useful to most people. The cost of formally registering a business in many developing countries is substantial relative to average incomes. In some countries, the fees and time involved represent months of average wages. The formal credit system excludes the poor because they lack the collateral and documentation that banks require. The labor market regulations that govern formal employment impose costs on small employers that make formal hiring economically impossible at small scales. Hernando de Soto, the Peruvian economist, spent years documenting what he called the mystery of capital, the fact that the informal sector in developing countries sits on vast quantities of assets, primarily housing, that cannot be used as capital because informal ownership has no legal recognition. A family that has lived in a house for 20 years, built it with their own labor, knows their claim is legitimate, and is recognized as the owner by their entire community, cannot use that house as collateral for a loan because there is no formal title. The asset exists in physical reality, but not in legal reality. De Soto estimated the value of such assets globally at over $9 trillion. Wealth that exists but cannot be mobilized because it sits outside the formal legal system. The informal economy serves a crucial function in developing countries. It employs people who would otherwise have no income. When formal sector employment is insufficient to absorb a growing working-age population, which is the case in virtually every rapidly urbanizing developing country, the informal sector provides a minimum of economic survival. The street vendor is not an ideal economic outcome, but it is far better than unemployment and starvation. What the informal economy does not do well is generate productivity growth, allow the accumulation of capital, enable workers to build skills and career paths, or generate the tax revenues that fund the public goods that improve economic conditions over time. The informal economy is an adaptation of failure. The failure of institutions, of formal credit systems, of public administration, and it perpetuates the conditions that require adaptation by denying the state the revenues it needs to improve those institutions. The challenge of economic development, for countries with informal sectors dominant, is not to suppress informality through enforcement, which is both expensive and ineffective. It is to make formality worth the cost, to simplify registration, to make formal credit accessible, to provide formal sector workers with protections and benefits that make the formal sector genuinely preferable. This is a generation-long institutional project that has succeeded in some countries, South Korea, Taiwan, Malaysia, and failed in many others. The global trade in counterfeit and pirated goods represents one of the fastest-growing criminal markets. The OECD estimates that trade in counterfeit goods reached $509 billion in 2019, representing 2.5% of world trade. Add digital piracy, counterfeit software, pirated music and films, fake streaming services, and the total is significantly larger. The counterfeit economy spans an extraordinary range of products. Counterfeit luxury goods, the fake Rolex, the imitation Louis Vuitton bag, are the most visible and most studied. But the counterfeit market extends to pharmaceuticals, auto parts, electronics, food and beverages, pesticides, aircraft components, and military equipment. The economic harm from luxury counterfeiting is primarily financial. The harm from counterfeit pharmaceuticals and auto parts can be lethal. Counterfeit pharmaceuticals represent a particularly dangerous subset of the shadow economy. The World Health Organization estimates that up to 10% of medicines in developing countries are counterfeit or substandard. In sub-Saharan Africa, counterfeit antimalarials cause an estimated 100,000 deaths per year. Counterfeit antibiotics contribute to antimicrobial resistance. Fake contraceptive pills lead to unwanted pregnancies and unsafe abortions. The harm extends from the individual patient who receives a counterfeit drug to the public health system, which faces resistance, additional disease burden, and erosion of trust in pharmaceutical systems. The production of counterfeit goods is geographically concentrated but widely distributed. China is the world's largest producer of counterfeit goods by a significant margin. The OECD estimates that China accounts for approximately 80% of all seized counterfeit goods by value. This is not because Chinese manufacturers are uniquely criminal. It is because China has a manufacturing infrastructure, the logistics networks, and the cost structure to produce goods cheaply enough that counterfeiting can be profitable even when the product must be hidden from customs inspection. The distribution channel for counterfeit goods have evolved dramatically with e-commerce. The third-party seller marketplaces of Amazon, Alibaba, and similar platforms have become major conduits for counterfeit goods, presenting them alongside genuine products in ways that make them difficult for consumers to distinguish. The platforms have been slow to address this problem because the counterfeit sellers pay the same fees as legitimate sellers and generate the same revenues. The economic incentive for the platform to vigorously police its marketplace is constrained by the revenue the counterfeiting generates. Human trafficking is not a single market. It is several overlapping markets with different structures, different participants, and different economics. The three largest segments are labor trafficking, sex trafficking, and organ trafficking, each with its own supply chain, pricing structure, and customer base. Labor trafficking is the largest segment by number of victims. The ILO estimates approximately 28 million people in forced labor globally. It operates in construction, agriculture, domestic service, fishing, and manufacturing. Victims are typically recruited with false promises of legitimate employment, transported to a destination where they have no legal status and no means of leaving, and exploited for their labor with minimal or no payment. Debt bondage, holding workers against notional debts incurred for transportation, housing, and food, is the primary mechanism of control. The economics of labor trafficking are straightforward and grim. An agricultural worker trafficked from Myanmar to Thailand for the fishing industry generates value. Fish caught, boats maintained, boats crewed. That significantly exceeds their subsistence cost. The trafficker captures the difference. The consumer of Thai shrimp captured by traffic labor is, unknowingly, participating in this market. Multiple investigative journalism outlets have documented the prevalence of forced labor in supply chains that produce food consumed by people who consider themselves ethically conscious consumers. This corruption has cascading effects on governance. A police force that is penetrated by drug cartel payments cannot effectively enforce any law, not just drug laws, because the same officers who take cartel money to ignore drug trafficking may take other money to ignore other crimes, may protect cartel members from legitimate enforcement, and may actively frame innocent people to demonstrate effectiveness. A judiciary penetrated by cartel payments cannot deliver justice for ordinary citizens, because the same corruption that protects cartel members perverts the entire system. A legislature penetrated by criminal money cannot pass effective criminal justice reform, because the same politicians who receive criminal contributions will block reforms that threaten their patrons. Mexico provides the clearest current case study of this dynamic. The Mexican drug cartels, with revenues estimated at $25 to $40 billion per year, have corrupted elements of the federal and state police, the military, the judiciary, the prison system, and multiple levels of government. The result is not just that drug trafficking continues despite enforcement effort. It is that the Mexican state's capacity to perform basic governance functions, maintaining public safety, delivering services, adjudicating disputes, is severely compromised in the regions where cartel power is strongest. There are municipalities in Mexico where the cartel effectively is the government, collecting revenues, enforcing order according to its own interests, providing basic services to maintain community tolerance. This is not unique to Mexico. It is a natural endpoint of any political economy in which criminal revenues are large enough relative to official revenues and salaries to make bribery economically rational for all parties. Afghanistan's opium economy, at its peak funding the Taliban's insurgency, corrupted the Afghan government to a degree that contributed directly to its collapse. The Democratic Republic of Congo's illegal mineral trade has helped fund a succession of armed groups that have made Eastern Congo one of the most violent and ungoverned spaces on Earth. The Albanian organized crime networks that emerged after the collapse of communism in the 1990s penetrated the political system to a degree that shaped the country's post-communist trajectory for a generation. The United States is not immune. The extraordinary political power of the pharmaceutical lobby, which spent decades blocking effective regulation of opioid marketing and prescribing, contributed to an opioid epidemic that killed more Americans than the Vietnam War. The lobbying was legal. The corruption was institutional rather than individual. But the mechanism, Private financial interests directing public policy in ways that cause enormous public harm is the same in structure as the bribe that protects a drug cartel. The illegal wildlife trade is one of the least discussed major criminal markets, perhaps because its victims cannot advocate for themselves and its practitioners are often geographically remote from the consumers who drive the demand. The UNOC estimates the illegal wildlife trade at approximately $23 billion per year, making it the fourth largest criminal market globally, behind drugs, human trafficking, and counterfeit goods. The trade encompasses ivory from poached elephants, rhinoceros horn, tiger bones and skins, pangolins, exotic birds, live reptiles, coral, and hundreds of other species. The economic logic of the wildlife trade is particularly distorted by scarcity. As a species becomes rarer, through hunting, habitat loss, and the declining population that poaching itself causes, the value of the remaining individuals to poachers and traders increases. Rhinoceros horn is worth more per kilogram than gold, not because it has any proven pharmaceutical efficacy. Traditional Chinese medicine claims have been repeatedly debunked by scientific research, but because rhinoceroses are becoming extremely rare and scarcity drives price. The trade thus creates a perverse feedback loop. The more effective poaching is at reducing a species' population, the higher the price for the remaining members, the stronger the economic incentive to hunt down every last individual. This is the economics of extinction. It is the same dynamic that drove the passenger pigeon, once the most numerous bird in North America with populations in the billions, to total extinction within decades of commercial hunting beginning. The last known individual died in the Cincinnati Zoo in 1914. The same dynamic threatens the rhinoceros, the elephant, the pangolin, and dozens of other species today. The demand side of the wildlife trade is concentrated primarily in East Asia, China and Vietnam being the primary markets for many products. Ivory is status symbol consumption. Rhinoceros horn is used medicinally. Pangolin scales are used in traditional medicine. Live exotic animals are kept as status pets. These are luxury consumption goods for wealthy consumers, and the economic logic of luxury consumption, that price is partly a signal of exclusivity rather than an obstacle to purchase, means that rising prices for scarce wildlife products can increase rather than decrease demand among status-seeking consumers. The illegal arms trade occupies a unique position in the shadow economy because it operates in close proximity to, and in many cases within, the legal arms trade. The United States, Russia, France, the United Kingdom, and China are the world's 5 largest arms exporters, generating tens of billions in legal arms sales annually. These sales are subject to end-use monitoring requirements. The stated purchaser is supposed to be the ultimate user, but the enforcement of these requirements is often weak. The diversion of legal arms to illegal markets happens at multiple points. Government stockpiles are raided or corruptly sold. Weapons sold to one government are transferred by that government to non-state actors in violation of their end-use commitments. Weapons supplied to armies that subsequently fragment, as happened with the Libyan military after Gaddafi's overthrow, are dispersed into regional conflict zones. Weapons sold in one country are smuggled into neighboring countries where the same weapons are prohibited. The illegal small arms trade, the market for pistols, assault rifles, and light weapons that fuel most of the world's current conflicts, is estimated at $1 to $3 billion annually in direct sales, though this number captures only the visible part of a market where much activity is state-sponsored, state-facilitated, or state-ignored. The human cost of this market is measured in the hundreds of thousands of deaths per year that occur in armed conflicts fueled by weapons that were at some point legally manufactured and that have since entered the legal supply chain. The economics of the arms trade, both legal and illegal, are profoundly distorted by the fact that the people who bear the cost of armed violence, civilians in conflict zones, are almost entirely absent from the market as buyers or sellers. The market is structured for the benefit of those who supply weapons and those who use them to gain and hold power. The majority of people who suffer the consequences have no market power at all. We have been focused primarily on criminal markets. But the shadow economy includes a vast legal or quasi-legal layer that operates through the use of tax havens, offshore financial centers, and the complex corporate structures that allow wealthy individuals and corporations to reduce their tax obligations dramatically. The Tax Justice Network estimates that approximately $7.6 trillion in private wealth is held offshore, primarily in the British Virgin Islands, Cayman Islands, Luxembourg, Switzerland, and similar jurisdictions. The global tax loss attributable to this offshore wealth is estimated at $189 billion per year for personal income taxes alone. Corporate tax avoidance, distinct from corporate tax evasion, which is illegal, exploits the gap between the letter of the law and its spirit. Multinational corporations shift profits to low-tax jurisdictions through techniques including transfer pricing manipulation, charging above market prices for goods and services between related companies in different countries, the use of intellectual property holding companies in low-tax jurisdictions, so that the operating companies in high-tax jurisdictions pay royalties to their own affiliated companies in tax havens, and thin capitalization, funding subsidiaries in high-tax countries with debt rather than equity, so that interest payments reduce taxable income. The Tax Justice Network estimates that corporate tax avoidance costs governments approximately $311 billion per year globally. Apple, Google, Amazon, and Facebook have all been investigated for aggressive tax planning that results in effective tax rates far below the nominal rates in the countries where they generate most of their revenues. The result is that the tax burden is shifted from mobile capital to immobile labor and consumption. Ordinary workers pay income tax and sales tax that cannot be avoided, while capital owners and corporations route their profits through structures that minimize or eliminate their tax liability. This is the shadow economy's most respectable face. It involves lawyers, accountants, and financial advisors who operate within the law. The products they create, the trust structures, the shell companies, the royalty arrangements, are legal in the jurisdictions where they are created, but their economic effect is identical to the money laundering that criminal organizations use. They move money from where it was generated, where it has social obligations, to places where it has none. We have traced the global shadow economy in its major manifestations. Now let us step back and ask the analytical question that the economists cannot avoid. What do we learn about how markets work from observing their legal forms? The first and most important lesson is that prohibition is not the same as elimination. A century of drug prohibition in the United States has not produced a drug-free society. It has produced the largest drug market in the world, an enormous incarceration system, a devastated rural heroin and methamphetamine epidemic, tens of thousands of overdose deaths annually, and the expenditure of over $1 trillion on drug enforcement since Nixon declared the war on drugs. This is not an argument for or against any particular drug policy. It is an observation about the effectiveness of prohibition as an economic policy. When a substance has inelastic demand, when people want it regardless of price, prohibition shifts the market structure rather than eliminating it. It raises prices by adding risk premiums. It transfers production to criminal enterprises. It funds violence through the monopoly profits that prohibition creates. It corrupts enforcement institutions through the bribery that high profit margins enable. The alternative, legalization and regulation, produces a different set of outcomes. Cannabis legalization in Colorado, California, and other U.S. states has largely displaced the illegal market with a legal one, depriving criminal enterprises of significant revenues, generating tax revenues for states, allowing quality control and consumer safety, and redirecting enforcement resources. The experience with cannabis legalization is not without problems. Concerns about youth access, about advertising, about the structure of the legal industry, but it has not produced the catastrophes that prohibition advocates predicted. The second lesson is about market structure and violence. Legal markets resolve disputes through courts. Illegal markets resolve disputes through violence. The extraordinary violence of the Mexican drug war, more than 350,000 homicides since 2006, many of them cartel-related, is not incidental to drug trafficking. It is the mandatory cost of operating a market without access to the legal dispute resolution mechanisms that legal markets take for granted. When Prohibition in the United States created a black market in alcohol from 1920 to 1933, it created Al Capone's Chicago outfit and the violence of the gang wars that defined that era. When Prohibition was repealed, the beer and whiskey industries became legal and boring. The violence disappeared because the profits that funded it disappeared, replaced by the much lower profits of competitive, taxed, regulated legal market. The same logic applies to drug prohibition. The third lesson is about information and quality. Legal markets use price, brand, and regulatory certification as signals of quality. Consumers can evaluate products, complain about defects, and rely on regulatory bodies to prevent the most dangerous products from reaching them. Illegal markets have no such mechanisms. The buyer of illicit drugs cannot know the purity of what they are purchasing. The contamination of heroin with fentanyl, a synthetic opioid 100 times more potent, has produced tens of thousands of overdose deaths because drug users had no way to know what was in their purchase. This is a market failure unique to prohibition. The inability to regulate quality produces death as a product defect. The shadow economy is not static. It evolves in response to technology, enforcement, and changing economic conditions. And the pace of its evolution is accelerating. The dark web has created global market access for illegal goods that previously required local or regional networks. A buyer in a small town can now access the same illegal product range as a buyer in a major city. The seller in China can reach the buyer in Australia without any physical connection. Cryptocurrency has created a payment system for illegal markets that is harder to trace than cash and easier to transfer internationally. The cat and mouse between law enforcement's blockchain analysis tools and the mixing services, privacy coins, and decentralized exchanges that obscure cryptocurrency flows is an ongoing arms race with no clear winner. Artificial intelligence is beginning to transform cybercrime. AI-generated voice cloning enables phone fraud at scale. AI-generated images enable identity fraud and non-consensual intimate imagery at scale. AI-generated text enables phishing attacks more convincing than any human writer could produce at comparable speed and volume. The productivity tools of legitimate work are equally available to criminal enterprises. The gig economy and the platform economy have created new vectors for shadow activity. Labor exploitation that was previously visible in specific industries is now dispersed across millions of platform-mediated transactions. The driver who is paid below minimum wage when all costs are factored in. The package delivery worker who is classified as a contractor to avoid labor protections. The content moderator in the Philippines earning a few dollars an hour to review traumatizing content for a platform that charges thousands per advertising placement. These are shadow economy dynamics wearing the clothes of the legitimate platform economy. What can be expected over the next decade is greater sophistication in both the shadow economy and the institutions designed to combat it. Blockchain analytics has already proven more useful to law enforcement than many in the cryptocurrency community anticipated. The seizure of $3.6 billion in Bitcoin from the Bitfinex hack in 2022 demonstrated that even sophisticated cryptocurrency users can be tracked when sufficient analytic resources are applied. AI-powered transaction monitoring is making anti-money laundering compliance more effective at the same time that AI is making the frauds is designed to detect more sophisticated. The informal economy in developing countries is being transformed by mobile money. Kenya's M-Pesa, launched in 2007, has brought millions of previously unbanked Kenyans into the formal financial system through mobile phone-based transactions, generating data trails that enable access to formal credit and formal services. Similar mobile money systems across Africa and Asia are gradually formalizing transactions that were previously entirely in the shadow, not through enforcement, but through the provision of genuinely useful financial services. The future of the shadow economy is not one of elimination. Markets that are demanded will be supplied. As long as governments prohibit substances that significant numbers of people want to consume, black markets will supply them. As long as poverty creates desperate people and wealthy buyers create demand for cheap labor and commercial sex, trafficking will occur. As long as tax systems impose obligations that can be avoided through sophisticated financial engineering, avoidance will occur. The trajectory that produces the best outcomes, on the evidence of the last century, is not the maximization of enforcement, but the design of better institutions. Tax systems that are harder to avoid. Drug policies that reduce harm while accepting that complete prohibition is unachievable. Labor protections that extend to informal and platform workers. Financial systems that provide genuine value to informal economy participants so that formalization becomes attractive. Anti-money laundering systems that actually prevent the financial system from processing criminal proceeds rather than generating compliance paper trails. None of this is simple or cheap, All of it requires sustained political will in the face of the economic interests, including the interests of legitimate institutions that benefit from proximity to the shadow economy, that resist change. But the alternative, continuing to fight a century-old war on markets that the century's experience suggests cannot be won, is not only expensive, it is counterproductive. It funds the criminal enterprises it purports to combat. It corrupts the institutions it empowers. It imprisons people it does not rehabilitate. And it leaves the shadow economy exactly where it has always been, running beneath the real one, feeding on it and feeding it, invisible to official statistics and essential to the lived reality of billions of people. The $3 trillion criminal shadow economy exists because demand for its products and services is real and persistent. The $10 trillion informal shadow economy exists because formal institutions are too costly, too weak, or too corrupt to serve the people they're supposed to serve. The tax haven shadow economy exists because the rules that govern capital are made by and for those who own it. None of this will be eliminated by moral condemnation. Markets respond to incentives, not to sermons. The challenge of addressing the shadow economy, in all its dimensions, is a challenge of designing institutions, regulations, and incentive structures that change the calculation of those who participate in it. That is a profoundly political challenge, because the shadow economy is not separate from political power. It corrupts political power where it is weak. It exploits regulatory gaps where it is complacent, and it purchases favorable treatment where it is strong. The shadow economy is not, ultimately, a separate economy. It is the official economy's shadow, produced by it, dependent on it, and producing it in return. Every policy that creates a black market, prohibition, a tariff, a labor regulation, creates a shadow. Every institution that enables money laundering, the shell company jurisdiction, the compliant bank, the anonymous trust, enables the shadow. Every tax structure that can be avoided by those with sufficient resources and cannot be avoided by those without extends a shadow. To illuminate the shadow economy fully would require nothing less than reform of the global financial system, the redesign of drug policy, the strengthening of institutional capacity in developing countries, and extension of basic labor protections to informal and platform workers globally. This is a generation's work at minimum, understanding it is the beginning, and the beginning is now. If this deep dive into the economy that runs beneath the economy gave you a new framework for understanding how markets really work, hit the like button. The algorithm buries content like this because it is long, complex, and does not fit a 30-second attention span. Your engagement is what keeps it alive. Subscribe if you want to keep following the money through every shadow it casts. And tell me in the comments, which part of the shadow economy most surprised you? Which aspect do you think is least well understood by the public? I want your analysis. Stay skeptical, stay informed, and keep watching.